Hello and welcome back to Simple Time Studios. Today we have our fourth episode of Axman Chronicles, going from early to late spring. Jacob is now a level 5 wise hunter and hoping things will finally settle down after his last adventure. Of course, we wouldn't have much of a story if they did. Rescued from the abandoned amusement park by Sheriff Quimby and his team, Jacob Flint was not surprised to find that the adventure ended with more than a few loose ends. He was saved, and so was Quimby's daughter. But the lodge members that had gathered in Cola World had disappeared, and so had the park's mysterious haunted mascots. It was a story that was becoming annoyingly familiar to Jacob now that his old troubles found him again. Still, the police were going over the entire park to try and find any clue where the cult had gone. There was an attempt to find out who currently owned the property and investigate them to see if they had any connection to the lodge. Jacob was not privy to that investigation or where it was going, but he suspected it would eventually reach a dead end with nothing that would help the larger investigation into the cult's activities. And speaking of dead ends, the follow-up on the haunted mascots almost immediately went nowhere. Olivia had recovered some surprisingly good video footage of all 4 of the mascots moving around and chasing after Flint on the park's barely functional security system, relieving Jacob with the knowledge that he wasn't crazy, even though it didn't answer the larger question about just what those cursed things were, especially after they had completely disappeared from the park. When Jacob told his story about the mascots, Quimby grew quiet and got this faraway look in his eyes before mumbling something about making some phone calls with some friends that have experience with this sort of thing. What he meant by that, the sheriff wouldn't say to anyone. Not to Jacob, that he had worked with for several years, or to Special Agent Abrams, who would have known about some special unit for whatever Halloween nonsense Jacob had stumbled upon. While it wasn't exactly comforting to know that one of his few friends had secrets that not even he could be trusted with, the look in Quimby's eyes told Jacob that whoever these other friends were, they were more than capable of handling whatever lurked in that abandoned theme park. Once Jacob and Sarah were free and reports were filled out as best as they could without everyone looking completely crazy, things started to wind down again. Jacob took this time to reflect on his performance in his last adventure and try to train further. The group drifted in different directions as work pulled them all away with other cases, other work. For a short while, Jacob was on his own again. Then his phone began to ring. Sitting in his living room one evening after a hard day of planting this year's crops, Jacob groaned as he looked at the caller ID and saw it wasn't a number he recognized. There was only a couple of things it could be, and he wasn't sure he was in the mood for dealing with any of them. Shaking his head, he picked up the phone on the 4th ring. Flint residence, Jacob Flint speaking. And no, I'm not interested in a new warranty for my pickup, he replied as he put the phone under his ear, not looking up from the manuscript he was reading. A neighbor in town apparently fancied himself a science fiction writer all of a sudden and wanted Jacob to read his manuscript and let him know what the hunter thought. "Oh, thank goodness, you're the mountain man that helped the FBI last year, right?" a female voice answered. A very loud female voice. Jacob suddenly wished he was dealing with a heavily accented telemarketer trying to sell him an auto warranty with a company that didn't exist. "Yes, that was me," he began reluctantly. "I rescued 2 hikers last October and helped the FBI and the Aussies rescue a missing computer professional shortly before Christmas. What can I help you with?" he asked. Already he could feel a headache and an urge to question his life choices coming on, and it had nothing to do with the binder holding a 300-odd-page pile of 8x11 computer paper on his lap. "My boyfriend is missing!" the female voice shrieked. Sighing, Jacob slid a receipt on his page and closed the binder before setting it aside. "All right, let me get something to write with," he replied before grabbing a spiral-bound notebook and a mechanical pencil. Something about this was already raising a big red flag in his mind, so he figured he'd better start documenting, if for no other reason than to explain to Quimby why he shot up his own living room again. Pencil in hand, he focused his attention back to the call. Okay, I got a pencil and some paper to write with. Let's start at the beginning. What is his name and what is your name? I'm Lisa Stravanowski. My boyfriend is Evan Smith, she replied. Was it Jacob's imagination, or was he picking up on a hint of annoyance in her voice? Jacob wrote both those names down in the order he asked, then quietly noted that she gave them in the opposite order before going to his next question. Okay, when did he disappear and what brought you to me? He asked, as much for his own curiosity as to help Quimby and the others later if this was an actual case. He kept his phone number fairly private, as much to keep it hidden from the lodge as from the kind of people that this Lisa might end up being. Almost 2 weeks ago now. He said he was going hiking in the woods with some friends out in Stone Forest State Park, but I know it was with that tramp, she practically screamed into the phone. Having survived abuse himself, Jacob realized there was a very distinct possibility that Lisa was Evan's boyfriend only in her mind, or that this disappearance was an intervention. Instinct told him to hang up the phone right then and there and block that number, but there was another part of him nudging him to finish asking her his questions first. All right, he began, acting like her outburst didn't happen. Do you know specifically where he disappeared, and have you already told the police he was missing? Tell the police? She asked. For some reason, the way she asked the question made his eyebrow twitch. Yes. Did you go to the police and tell them what happened? Did they investigate, but the trail went cold? Did they dismiss your report completely? He continued, writing down every answer she gave so far. I didn't go to the police. I'm going to be in town tomorrow morning, and you're going to help me find him, Lisa answered, then hung up before Jacob could reply. Jacob stared at the silent phone, then sighed and finished writing down all his notes. Last time it was a rich televangelist Bible twat. Today it was a woman who is almost certainly white, drinks pumpkin spice lattes bigger than my head, and is so liberal that her blood probably looks like blueberry Kool-Aid. Jesus H. Roosevelt Christ on an inverted cross. At this rate, my next move is going to be to a bunker out in the absolute middle of nowhere, he snarled before putting the phone back up to his ear and dialing a number he knew by heart. Hello, is this the sheriff's office? Hi, Rachel. I guess they have you manning the phones tonight. Is Quimby in, or one of his deputies? And is the records guy in as well? What's his name, Michael? They're all here, Jacob. What do you need? Rachel answered. I just got off the phone with this strange lady, one Lisa Stravanowski. She is trying to get me to help her look for her missing boyfriend, Evan Smith. Said he went missing in Stone Forest about 2 weeks ago. There was a sound of Rachel clicking a few keys on her computer as she brought up a file to make a report. That's odd. I'll make sure to pass that on to the sheriff, especially since I don't recall a case file for an Evan Smith. There probably isn't one. Miss Stravanowski said she didn't report his disappearance to the police. She also said she's going to be in town tomorrow morning and that I am going to help her find him, he added. And did you agree? Rachel asked worriedly. Jacob could mentally see her doing the exact same thing he was doing a few minutes ago, writing everything down in case he ends up another missing person connected to this Lisa Stravanowski. He couldn't blame her. His phone call with Lisa had raised more red flags than a communist rally. It was best to document everything in triplicate to make it easier to retrace his steps in case something goes wrong. She hung up before I could say anything. Honestly, I'm kind of split between going along with it to see where it goes, or having Quimby or one of the other deputies drop by my place for morning coffee when she arrives. Jacob, we just saved you from one abduction scheme, and barely chase off that Godson fellow for now. Please tell me you're not seriously considering helping some white trash Karen from the suburbs, Rachel replied. Seriously considering it? No. Thinking about it? Yes. I mean, part of me is curious just what's going on here, and I would like to know how she got my phone number. It's not like I advertise on social media, he answered. I'll pass this on to the sheriff. Don't do anything until we call you back, Rachel insisted, sounding as concerned as Jacob felt. Don't worry. Honestly, I'd rather be reading that book Tim's trying to write. Already up to chapter 5. Timmy Thunder's book? You're actually reading that thing? Rachel replied with disbelief. Timmy Thunder was one of Clearbrook's resident handymen. Everyone in town found him a bit weird, but otherwise just a harmless, burnt-out, gifted kid that was good with his hands. Whether or not he was just as good with a word processor was something no one else was willing to find out until now. Honestly, not as bad as you'd think. I mean, I got questions about some of the choices he made, like why this is set in the 90s, and where did he come up with some of these aliens. Like there's this weird species of Amazonian catgirl hunters that he's finally introducing in this chapter. Other than that, it's been pretty good except for the usual spelling and grammar mistakes. I think he might actually have a decent young adults novel with a couple more passes. That's nice. Have fun with that. I'll make sure someone hears about this and gets back to you later, Rachel replied and hung up. Jacob set his phone back down and went back to Tim's book. Captain Positron pushed his starship, the Juicy T-Bone, as fast as it could go as he raced to warn the Lionlings before the Dread Star Lord Conlynx and his diabolical army of marauders invaded their planet. A fierce matriarchy of prideful hunters, they would be a strong member of the Allies of Freedom if Captain Positron could only convince them to join. Laughing, Jacob took his pencil and wrote a few comments in the margin. Lionlings? Is that supposed to be a pun? And how do you pronounce the bad guy's name? Conlynx? He scribbled in the margins before putting the pencil down and getting back to reading. Other than little comments like that, Tim's story was glorious 90s cheese. Silly names, silly heroes, a positive upbeat atmosphere. The protagonist was a kid that built a spaceship out of junk and powered it with a strange meteorite he found while camping. It was a happy, silly space opera serial that was oozing with optimism as can-do heroes fought against a villain out to conquer the galaxy, seemingly because he wanted to conquer it. He was still reading when the sheriff's department called him back. Putting the manuscript aside, he listened to what Quimby and the others thought of his encounter with Lisa Stravanowski. Turns out Michael and Records had done some digging on Lisa and Evan while he and Rachel were waiting for Quimby to finish meeting with his friends that knew how to deal with haunted soda mascots. What Michael had found was interesting. Very interesting. So interesting that not only did Quimby think that Jacob should start searching Stone Forest first thing tomorrow morning, but the sheriff also wanted to meet with Miss Stravanowski personally. And upon hearing what Records had found himself, Jacob agreed to Quimby's scheme without a second's hesitation. That night, Jacob prepped his gear and loaded it in his truck before setting his alarm. The next morning, he woke at sunrise, got dressed, shoved a piece of toast in his mouth, and jumped in his truck before driving off for Stone Forest National Park about an hour and a half east of town. The drive was peaceful, and the weather was typical of a late spring morning. The sun was shining, there was barely a cloud in the sky, and most folks hadn't started commuting to work yet. He had just parked at the main ranger station and waved to the sheriff and his 2 deputies when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Looking at the screen, he shook his head. It was Lisa Stravanowski's number. "Hello, Jacob Flint here." "Where are you? You're not at your house! she bellowed through the phone. The sound of a car horn blaring could be heard in the background, causing the sheriff and his deputies to all abruptly turn their heads and look at Jacob. Rolling his eyes, Jacob tried to avoid putting his phone too close to his ear. "Well, you never gave me a time, or specified what you were paying me, or even explained how you got my address or my phone number. So I went right to Stone Forest State Park at first light. I'm there right now." "I will be right there!" she screamed and hung up. Jacob sighed and started to put his phone back in his pocket. "I'm going to take a complete guess and predict that she's a fat bitch driving an SUV. No wonder this guy filed a restraining order against her 2 weeks ago." He grumbled as he looked up at the officers looking back at him. "What?" Quimby laughed. "Well, she does look like a walking stereotype." The sheriff laughed and sent a few pictures to Jacob's phone. Raising his phone back up, Jacob opened the pictures the sheriff sent him. The first was of a man, Caucasian, looked to be in his mid to late 20s, so about Jacob's own age. Black hair was short and straight, eyes were hazel, and the man seemed to have this nervous, slim smile like he wasn't sure if he should be smiling or not. "Is this Evan Smith?" Jacob asked. "Yeah, that's him. One of the last pictures of himself he uploaded onto social media before he vanished," Quimby replied. "Okay. Is there anything that appears off about the man in the picture, like an injury or a bruise?" "I give it a likely, and 85 says no, there isn't." Jacob looked over the photo and zoomed closer to the man's face. Nothing seemed out of place. Either the bruises had healed or they weren't visible to begin with. He then cycled to the next picture and held it up as he looked at Quimby. "You weren't kidding about the walking stereotype." "Yep, that's Miss Stravanowski," the sheriff chuckled. Lisa Stravanowski most definitely had the kind of appearance that her loud voice and perpetual impatience seemed to suggest. As Jacob suspected, she was a Caucasian woman, blonde with her hair worn straight and in a classic Karen haircut. A very, very large woman, the kind of woman that liked her pumpkin spice lattes with an extra hit of heavy cream, and her face was fixed in a kind of scowl of someone that knew how to use her weight to bully anyone smaller than herself. Looking over his shoulder to make sure Lisa hadn't arrived yet, Jacob scrolled over to find himself looking at the tramp that Lisa had been screaming about the night before. Definitely African, though whether or not she was African American was something he couldn't tell without a little more information. Body was athletic like a regular gym junkie. Clothing was made to fit but otherwise nondescript. Black hair was worn long and braided. She had a warm smile, but it was her eyes that drew his attention. "Are her eyes purple?" he asked, still studying the picture. "Yeah, must be contacts or something, but yeah, that's Jane Doe," Quimby replied, causing Jacob to look up in disbelief. "Yes, Flint, as far as we can tell, that is her legal name, Jane Doe. Can't find much more about her beyond that picture in the next one, though," he began. Jacob swiped along on reflex, and what he saw made him do a double take. "Yeah, the only other picture we can find of her anywhere is a social media post from that big furry convention down in Pittsburgh. Apparently, she took first prize at a costume contest they had last year," Quimby explained with a chuckle. Jacob could immediately see why Jane won first place. Her costume was of a buff, golden-furred anthropomorphic lioness with purple eyes, a glorious head of jet black hair, and dressed like some sort of sci-fi warrior woman. A black bodysuit covered her from her neck down to her uncovered digigrade feet. Metallic armor plating with a bright brass-like coloration covered the vitals. Her wrists were wreathed in matching bracers that were studded with some kind of technological doodads. And lastly, some sort of long tube-shaped weapon was worn across her back. Finally, Jacob's eye drifted to the monocle worn over her eye, the lens polished until it looked like a sapphire, and a belt worn across her toned waist. Jacob stared at the belt and its ornate buckle for what seemed like a long time, then quickly dialed a number he did not expect to call while he was hunting for a missing person. The number for Tim Thunder, the local repair guy. "Hi, Tim. Sorry to wake you up this early. I can't talk long. Quimby has me looking for another person lost in the woods. But I am enjoying the book. I just finished Chapter 5 last night. Captain Positron has just convinced the Lion Lynx to join the fight against the Marauder army." "Look, weird question. I'm the only one that has seen this manuscript, right? You haven't shown your book to anyone else, right?" "I am? Cool. Yeah, we'll talk about it later," Jacob replied before hanging up. Quimby regarded Jacob with a raised eyebrow as the two of them started walking towards the ranger station with the others. "His book is that good?" "Sorry. Had to be a coincidence. There's only so many ideas you can create," Jacob replied as he pocketed his phone. "But her costume looks enough like something he cooked up in his head that you had to go check if he had any more of those beta readers," Quimby added with a knowing nod. "Jacob, every case that somehow involves you has been strange ever since we rescued those two kids last fall. If anything, thanks for warning me this might be another one." "I hope it's not, because I will have so many questions for Tim if this gets weird," Jacob replied as they walked into the ranger station. "You and me both, Jacob. I might even have to read that book when you're done with it if this becomes another case of the strange, the damned, and the damned strange," Quimby agreed with a shake of his head. The ranger on duty was already talking with Quimby's deputies as Jacob went over to study the map of the park. Jacob listened for the important details as he looked at a map of the park pinned behind a glass pane. Yes, a man matching Evan's description was last seen 2 weeks ago entering the park with a woman matching Jane Doe's description and the strangest Midwestern accent you ever heard. They apparently had entered and exited the park several times, with the last time being 2 days ago, which is why the rangers didn't think to file a report or call the police. Nothing seemed amiss about either of them. Neither showed concerning signs of duress. Jacob was not thrilled to hear that. For some reason, Tim's Captain Positron was also from the American Midwest. But that was a question for after this case. Right now, he needed to look at the map and try to narrow down where a man looking to escape might hide. Okay, Jacob makes a survival check with a 1d20 plus 6 to study the map of the park and look for good camping or hiding spots and see if there's anything else he notices about the terrain. He rolls a 25. Yeah, he figures out everything there is to see. Stone Forest was a heavily wooded park that cut through a densely forested part of the Appalachian Mountains. Several trails weaved through the forest before weaving through the mountains with multiple switchbacks. It was also clearly a hiking park for the most part. No waterways or lakes that would support fishing. No permanent cabins or hunting camps, though deeper in the park had a few meadows that looked like good spots to pitch a tent so long as the bears and wolves behaved. One meadow in particular was fairly deep in the park, towards the end of a trail that included 2 switchbacks through steep terrain. It was the best place to hide and probably to start looking as well, but it involved hiking a good several miles one way. Would Evan and Jane be willing to hike somewhere that far several times in the last 2 weeks? He checked the name of the meadow on the map, Serenity, and it was, ironically, in the middle of a little bowl-shaped valley in the mountains. "Did they say where in the park they were going?" he asked the ranger being interviewed by the sheriff's department. A neon yellow Hummer just pulled into the dirt parking lot by the ranger station. "All right, did they tell the rangers where they were going?" I give it a 50-50, and 63 says no. The ranger shook his head. "No idea, but wherever it is, it was pretty deep. They hadn't come out yet, and that was 2 days ago," he answered just as the sound of someone leaning on their car horn echoed through the car park and made everyone jump. Quimby shook his head. Guess we better get started. Jacob, get started and keep your radio on the usual frequency. Call us if you find anything related to Evan or Jane. Ryan, Connor, you're with me. Let's go say hello to our new friend, the sheriff ordered. Realizing the sheriff was doing him a very big favor, Jacob nodded and exited the ranger station through a back door and started climbing up the trail leading deeper into the state parkland. He had just disappeared past the tree line when he heard the sound of shouting from the parking lot. Grumbling to himself, he started walking up the hill much more quickly. He was already looking at a very long walk, and likely one where he was going to be grateful he came in armed. The state park was definitely a very pretty forest. The trees had all bloomed, and there was the faint hint of pollen still in the air. It wasn't quite camping season yet, so Jacob wasn't particularly likely to run into many people. Then again, if he did, it wasn't like he couldn't just tell the truth and tell them that the sheriff was down at the ranger station at the foot of the trail. Arriving at a fork in the trail, he headed off in the direction that would take him to Serenity Meadow. No one had explicitly said that was where the two were off to, but he couldn't think of many other places on the map that were remote. Why were they coming up here so often, though? None of the answers Jacob came up with made much sense. He currently didn't have much that implied Evan and Jane were lovers beyond Lisa's paranoid shrieks, and if they did, there was a number of motels up and down the nearby highway that would have been a better choice. And if they were just friends, then why come here repeatedly when Evan could be tracked down? Nothing made sense. He needed more clues, or preferably to find either of them and get some answers. Walking along the trail to Serenity, he kept his eyes open for recent activity and any signs that Evan and Jane in particular were using this trail. Okay, Jacob is going to make a perception check with a 1d20 plus 9. He gets a 23. Is there anything related to Evan or Jane for him to find on this trail? I give it a 50-50. 61 again. He's very certain that there is nothing of note this early on the trail. Well, there were signs that someone had been walking this way recently, broken branches and disturbed leaves. There was nothing that specifically singled out who Jacob was looking for in this area. Then again, Jacob still wasn't sure what he was looking for. Was Jane a woman that made costumes with the skill of a master, or a false identity assumed by an alien from beyond the stars? Shaking his head, he kept walking on. Find them first, get answers second. Yet as he continued to climb up the trail, walking back and forth along the first switchback, he realized that all of his questions hinged on finding Jane. He brought up his phone again and looked at her pictures. Where, oh where are you hiding? Okay, Jacob is going to spend a focus point, bringing his current total down to 4, to use Hunter's Mark on Jane. This gives him advantage on perception and survival checks to find her, and opens her up to his marked as prey ability if they get into combat. Jacob put his phone away and continued on, the hairs on his neck starting to stand up as he felt like he was being watched. Yet when he looked, he couldn't see anyone. Yet the feeling persisted, causing him to slow down and stop himself from reaching for the shotgun worn over his shoulder, as he carefully looked both ahead of him and behind him. Jane? Evan? Jacob shouted as he continued to walk along. The trail soon straightened itself out as Jacob finished climbing the first switchback, weaving through a dense forest with underbrush sprouting up where the forest canopy broke and let sunlight stream through. A flicker of movement and a flash of yellow to his left caught his eye, but disappeared as soon as he turned his head for a better look. Jacob kept walking, the urge to draw his shotgun growing, as he followed the trail towards the Serenity Meadow. Every so often he would call out again, Jane? Evan? Are you there? He called out. He shook his head and kept walking. That was a pointless question. Of course she was here. If it wasn't her, then someone else was doing an excellent job of toying with him. Okay, Jacob makes a perception check to spot Jane. He has advantage on a 1d20 plus 9. He gets a 28. He sees something, all right. As he walked along and approached the second switchback, Jacob spotted a faint shimmer of light and the outline of something vaguely humanoid darting between the trees. Whatever the blur was, it was heading towards his meadow and making better time than he was, but still had to navigate the same terrain he did. He picked up his pace and ran after it. "Jane! Jane! Come on, let's talk like two adults," he called after the translucent figure, not at all surprised by its appearance at this point. "Let's talk, human to lionling," he shouted. That word was all it took. The shimmering figure stopped and decloaked. Jane stood a good 30 feet from Jacob. Purple eyes narrowed as she looked back at Jacob. "Who are you? How do you know my species?" she asked accusingly, a feline hiss tinged with that Midwestern accent escaping her lips as she pulled the metal rod from off her back and gripped it tightly in her right hand. "Jacob Flint. I look for missing people like Evan Smith. As for knowing that," he began, gesturing to her clearly alien appearance as he was still at a loss for words, even after expecting this adventure to take a weird turn. "I'm still trying to figure that part out myself. Let's just say I'm going to have a lot of questions for someone in town once I get done with this." Is Jane suspicious enough to be hostile towards Jacob? I'm going to give that a very likely, and 73 on the Oracle dice says yes. She is most definitely suspicious. "A hunter of missing people? She sent you, didn't she?" Jane asked accusingly. Neither of them needed to elaborate on who she was. "Yes, but," he began, holding up his hands in protest. "She's not taking him!" The alien lioness roared and took up a fighting stance, her metal staff morphing into a long, wicked-looking spear, her body tensing up like an Olympian javelin thrower as she stood poised to throw. Okay, and now we roll for initiative. Jane is, naturally, using the alien hunter stat block. Jacob rolls a 10 on a 1d20 plus 1 for initiative. Jane got an 8 on a 1d20 plus 3. Okay, Jacob got really lucky. "Oh, come on, can't we just talk about this?" Jacob shouted as he ducked behind a large oak tree and drew his shotgun before dropping down into a crouch to make himself a smaller target. "Do you not know how long he has tried to escape that vile female?" Jane shrieked and flung her spear with all her might. Okay. Jane's spear multi-weapon uses the stats of the returning blade. So 1d20 plus 7 for 10. Penetration value of 3, which matches the armor value of the tree trunk, currently giving Jacob total cover. Jacob felt the tree reverberate from the impact of spear hitting wood and the bronze-colored tip of the weapon just starting to penetrate through the wooden trunk directly above his head. If the tree hadn't been there and she aimed just a little bit lower. Ducking around the tree, he braced the butt of his shotgun against his shoulder and fired back at Jane. Okay, going to attack with his shotgun and attack twice. First attack is a 7, which misses. Second attack is an 11, which also misses. But since Jacob has Hunter's Mark on her, he's going to make a third shot. Third shot is a 21, which hits. 2d6 plus 1 gets me 8 total. I will not be spending a focus point on marked as prey this round. Jane has 82 HP left. Practice hands became a blur as he quickly fired off 3 shots in rapid succession. The first attack went off completely cocked, hitting a tree that was a few feet away from the alien huntress. The second shot narrowly missed her as she dodged out of the way. Using the second one to lead her into a third, he fired and connected. A thin splash of crimson blood splattered against the side of a tree as his third shot connected somewhere along her abdomen. Heart hammering into his chest, he dived back into cover and quickly replaced the 3 shotgun shells now littering the floor. It was her move. Okay, does Quimby try to get Jacob on the radio? It was very likely, since he just traded shots with someone and fired several rounds with a weapon that has the loud quality. 85. Guess Jacob has to make the first call. Shotgun reloaded, Jacob peered around a tree just as the spear sticking out of it began to pull backwards as if it was held by a giant invisible hand before flying back to his opponent. Jane caught it midair, scowled at Flint before she quickly cloaked and disappeared into the underbrush. 1 long second became 2, his heart still pounding in his chest as he tried to listen for Jane. What was her goal? Was she trying to flank him, or was he missing something obvious? Do you not know how long he has tried to escape? Jacob could already tell that Evan had some unpleasant history with Lisa, but it sounded like things had been going on for longer than he expected. With his gun still in hand, the human hunter grabbed his radio with his free hand. "Sheriff, it's Jacob. I ran into Jane." He called the sheriff, eyes still open for his opponent trying and sneak up on him. "That's good, Jacob. Is she cooperative?" Sheriff Quimby replied over the radio. Was it Jacob's imagination, or was there a strange static echo on their radios all of a sudden? "No, Quimby, she attacked me before I could tell her that the police are involved. We traded shots and then she escaped. Probably ran back to where Evan's hiding. How are things down there with Lisa Stravanovsky?" "That figures. Can't say I blame her after what we found in Lisa's Hummer," Quimby replied, his voice trailing off. "Sheriff?" Jacob pressed, his eyes still scanning his surroundings as it became more and more clear that Jane was no longer toying with him. The sheriff sighed. "Long story short, Jacob, we have her in custody. She's screaming about all cops being bastards, of course, but there were things in that Hummer that were raising too many damn questions. Unfortunately for her, with both Evan and her being out of state and from different states entirely, the FBI needs to get involved. Which means we might be seeing Special Agent Abrams again soon. Either way, go follow after Jane and report what you find. You're heading to that one meadow that's way out there, Serenity or something?" "Yeah, I ran into Jane on the way there. I'll keep going and report what I find," Jacob replied as he started to hike after where Jane had disappeared to. He had a lot of ground to cover, and she had a head start on him. "All right, be careful, though. You're on your own out there. And Jacob?" the sheriff cautioned. "Jacob, Connor and Ryan started a bet after you left. Do we need to have a chat with Tim about his book after this is over?" Jacob sighed. "Quimby, I don't know about you, but I'm definitely going to need to have a very long talk with Tim about Captain Positron. I'll call you back when I have something," he replied as he kept walking. Sheriff Quimby muttered under his breath. "I figured as much. Keep me posted." Jacob put the radio back on his harness pocket and started running along the trail with his shotgun pressed against his chest. Jane looked like she was wounded, but with her almost certainly alien physiology, that hit could have been nothing more than a paper cut. Even if it wasn't, she still had a significant head start over Jacob that he needed to work to overcome. So he started to push and see if he couldn't close the gap. Okay, Jacob is going to make an endurance check to see if he can maintain a sustained sprint. That's a 1d20 plus 6. He gets an 11. Well, he doesn't fail, at least. The brisk run through the trail and up the second switchback took a lot out of him and left him gasping for breath as he reached the top, but he did make good time. Catching his breath, he resumed following the trail. Serenity awaited. The trail led through another dense body of trees before opening up into a picturesque meadow valley that looked like something out of a painting or a postcard. Butterflies fluttered between all manner of colorful wildflowers. Jacob spent a second to enjoy the beauty in front of him before hugging the tree line and trying to disappear. Okay, Jacob's going to attempt a stealth check to hide himself so he can quietly observe the meadow. 1d20 plus 4, and he gets a 15. Well, he thinks he's hidden. Ducking behind some underbrush and lying prone, Jacob shouldered his shotgun and drew his hunting rifle before setting it down by his side. His rifle close at hand, he pulled a pair of binoculars out of his backpack and started scanning the meadow for signs of Jane or a campsite. This deep in the woods, there had to be some sign that someone was here. And rather than make him roll, I'm just going to narrate his perception. At first it looked like there was nothing that was immediately obvious to his trained hunter's eye. Tents and hiking clothes tended to use synthetic fabrics with bright, unnatural colors that immediately stood out against natural greens and browns. His first sweep revealed nothing. Then the second, there was a splash of red where there wasn't supposed to be. A thin trail of blood in the tall grass that abruptly ended right at the foot of a small foothill smack in the middle of the meadow. A foothill that wasn't supposed to be there if the map he saw before was accurate. Getting on his radio again, he called Quimby up on the usual channel. "Sheriff, I'm at this meadow. No sign of a campsite, but it looks like Jane passed through here recently, so she's somewhere around here." "Understood, Jacob. I'll see about sending someone else up there, so just try to observe what you can in the meantime," Quimby responded. "So you have no intention to give up on your hunt?" A familiar female voice interjected over the radio and startled both men. "Hello, Jane. I guess we should have figured that you'd have the ability to eavesdrop on radio chatter," Jacob replied with a sigh once he recovered his wits. "You shot me," she replied coldly. "And you threw a spear at me after I asked if we could try to talk this out like adults. I suppose if you can do this, then you can see where I'm hidden," Jacob replied, painfully aware that the sheriff was listening and still couldn't do a thing to help him. "You're hidden in the brush right next to the trail leading back to the park entrance, lying on the ground with your rifle next to you. Decent hunter's form," she answered. "And that huge foothill in the middle of the meadow is where you're hiding your ship? Is that camouflage netting or some sort of Star Trek hologram nonsense? How did you—" "Topographical map in the ranger station says this whole meadow is supposed to be flatter than a pancake. So either the map is wrong or you need to do a better job blending in with the terrain. That and you left a trail disappearing in the foothill," Jacob answered. There was an angry feline growl on the channel for a moment. "I guess Lisa found a competent cred blade," Jane snarled. Jacob didn't need to guess what a cred blade was. "Lisa is arrested. The other guy on this channel is Sheriff Quimby, chief lawman for the entire county. He has her in police custody. She tried to press me into helping her find Evan. I called Quimby's office because her request was fishier than the Fulton fish market. We were helping her at first because Quimby's people kept turning up more questions than answers, and we wanted to get to the bottom of this." There was a pause, and both men could hear Jane turn and whisper to someone else at her end, presumably Evan. Jacob realized he probably should have tried to control his slang a little better. At this point, it was obvious Jane was an alien. She wasn't going to get human idioms and slang on the first go. There was a silence, and Quimby cleared his throat. "I understand tempers are running a little hot right now. Any chance we can just discuss this in person over lunch? I know a quiet place that's pretty remote where we can talk without someone else sticking their nose into things. Jacob knows the place I'm thinking of." "Quimby, are you seriously inviting them over to my homestead on the outskirts of town?" Jacob replied. Bold of both of you to think that this can be resolved by simply sharing a meal together, Jane interrupted as the foothill disappeared in a shimmer of light, revealing what looked like a prototype jet plane. A second later, the ship's engines fired and nearly blinded Jacob with a bluish-white glow before Jane's spaceship took off straight into the sky. If he was a betting man, Jacob bet that Jane would be in space with Evan before anyone on the ground could respond. His radio squawked. "Jacob, did she just do what I think she did?" Quimby asked over the radio. Jacob pressed down his radio to talk back. "Yeah, she did. Unless you got something that can race a spaceship, I think Evan's going to stay missing," he replied before turning around and walking back down the trail with a sigh. A little while later. A few hours later, Jacob was back at his homestead and cleaning up his living room for the guests he didn't expect this morning. Weapons were put away. The binder with Tim's manuscript had been closed and set aside on the bookshelf for safekeeping. Finally, Sheriff Quimby arrived with Timothy Thunder in tow. Tim was a tall, spindly, pale man with short blonde hair and bags under his pale blue eyes. He also looked genuinely confused why he was here. "Hi, Jacob. Glad you're enjoying my book. What is this all about?" Tim asked as he looked around. Jacob and Quimby looked at each other and tried to figure out the best way to start. Jacob finally pulled out his phone and brought up the pictures of Jane Doe. "These pictures are what I called you about earlier this morning, particularly the second one." Tim looked at the two pictures, his eyes growing wide with recognition as he saw the second picture. "A lionling? No, it can't be. It has to be a coincidence." "Trust me, it wasn't," Jacob replied. "Chased that woman all the way up the mountain in Stone Forest. Her magnetic spear thingy nearly gave me a new hole, and she had that weird cloaking gizmo, like something out of that one movie with Arnie," he added. Tim laughed, and then his eyes went wide as he looked at Jacob's serious expression. "I think I understand why you two wanted me here," he smiled nervously. Quimby tapped the binder holding Tim's manuscript and gently took it off the shelf before skimming the first few pages. "This is all real, isn't it? You were Captain Positron, the 9-year-old boy genius who went on all those adventures back in the 90s. "Yes," Tim answered with a defeated sigh, like he was forced to admit that he was once a legendary athlete that had been benched by a career-ending injury ever since. "But what does that have to do with the case you had this morning?" Quimby nodded and picked up Jacob's phone to cycle between Jane and Evan's pictures. "This lady right here intervened in a very, very disturbing and abusive relationship between this man and a woman who can't be transferred out of my jail cell soon enough. I just need to know I can count on you for some help, since apparently I'm the first police officer to sort out an interplanetary kidnapping case since Jane ran off with Evan. I think I saw that other lady at the coffee shop this morning. Blonde, screams like a banshee, drives an obnoxious yellow Hummer?" Tim asked with a chuckle. "Yep, that's her, although she's probably looking at some serious prison time, based on what we have," Quimby nodded. "Though now that I think about it, there is one other question I have for you, Tim. Jacob, you said Tim's book has had some villain in it, some Darth Vader wannabe named Conlinx or something?" "Yeah, the Dread Star-Lord Conlinx, Master of the Marauders, Lord of Terror, King of Carnage, War Master of the Sixth Infernal Star," Jacob added, listing off the Star Tyrant's many titles with a bored, mocking tone. "Yeah, him," Quimby agreed. "Normally I don't ask for spoilers, and I'm definitely going to be reading your book once Jacob's done in case we get any more nonsense from outer space, but this Conlinx fellow is defeated by the end of the book, right?" "Right?" he asked Tim hopefully. Tim shook his head. "No, we were so close, but we fell short. He's still out there and he knows where Earth is. Quimby and Jacob looked at each other. Shaking his head, Jacob silently walked over to the little whiteboard he kept on his refrigerator to write down a constantly evolving to-do list. Below, chop firewood and plant root vegetables in the southern plot. He quickly scribbled down a third chore. Buy more ammo, before making sure to underline it for emphasis. End of story.